Excellent. Well, it's looking to be about that time, so let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for everyone for dialing in to our fourth webinar with Barbara Means and Jen Russell on designing a formative evaluation system for complex systems. Like I said, this is the fourth in our webinar series. We'll have our final one today with Jeremy Rochelle and Chris Thorne from Carnegie on network communication. And these will wrap us up on the webinar series and get us ready for the face-to-face meeting starting March 14th. Application deadline is passed, and we are quickly going through those and sending out notifications. If you have any questions or need any information both on the Include Center as well as the webinar series, we have the website at includecenter.org. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Jen Russell, who will get us started on today's topic, formative evaluation in complex systems. So I'll turn it over to you, Jen.
Very good. So today I'll be talking about developmental evaluation for networked improvement communities. There we go. My name's Jen Russell. I'm an Associate Professor of Learning Sciences in the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh and a research scientist at our Learning Research and Development Center. I also work as a fellow with the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. So we're talking about networked improvement communities. So just as a quick refresher, NICs are scientific professional learning communities that are distinguished by 4 essential characteristics. They're focused on a well-specified and common aim. They're guided by a deep understanding of the problem that the network is organized to address and the system that produces it, as well as a theory for making progress or improvement towards that aim. They're disciplined by the rigor of improvement science, and then they're coordinated to accelerate the development, testing, and refinement of interventions and their effective integration into varied educational contexts. NICs are highly structured networks, and we organize them that way for a number of reasons. A network of educators working on a common problem can be an enormous source of innovation. Networks also allow us to see patterns amongst many people, say, trying interventions that otherwise would look particular. Having educators working in diverse contexts enables a network to accelerate knowledge acquisition from testing innovations under diverse conditions. The social connections that emerge in a network enable us to accelerate testing and diffusion. People see successes others are having, and then others want to try similar interventions. We can also build safe environments in NICs to engage in comparative examination of results. This helps to create a sense of moral urgency. If others can do it, why can't we? And creates conditions for learning exchanges. And finally, the infrastructure and social connections ease translational research. So lots of potential for networks, but because of the way networks are organized, there's also a lot of complexity involved in operating a structured network. And so, you know, that complexity is generated through the fact that participation is generally voluntary, and so we have to think carefully about how we motivate and sustain participation in the network. Membership can be more fluid than it might be in a more formal organization. Additionally, the social structure of a network may not be as easily observable as, say, the organizational chart in a formal organizational structure. So it's something we have to directly investigate and understand who's collaborating with whom and how. And the fact that networked improvement communities often cut across organizations and even geographic regions makes communication and joint work challenging. So with all the promise, there's also the complexity of organizing structured networks. And for those reasons, because of the complexity of organizing as a network, it's really important to understand and track how the network itself is developing if you're operating in a network improvement community. And the approach that we at Carnegie have taken to this is through a developmental evaluation perspective. We're drawn to the developmental evaluation approach because it facilitates real-time feedback to network leaders, facilitating continuous improvement and learning. It also supports the development of the network in dynamic environments, and the developmental evaluation kind of approach and frameworks take into account those dynamic environments, and also support methodological flexibility and adaptability. And in this developmental evaluation work, we're really focusing in on the development of the network. There's lots of analytics work that happens in a networked improvement community, tracking progress towards an aim, tracking the uptake of interventions, and using process measures. But I just want to note that the developmental evaluation work is really focused on the emergence of a NIC as a social organization. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Barbara, and then I'll come back with some more specific information about our developmental evaluation work.
Right, is my screen showing?
Yes.
And you can hear me? Hopefully.
Yes.
Someone can hear me? I'm going to assume this is working okay unless Andy comes to my door and grabs me. Thanks, Jen, for that introduction. I'm someone who has not been directly involved in the Carnegie NIC work. I've been an admirer from outside and certainly trying to borrow some of the ideas and approaches that I found useful. So I'm really going to try to answer a question that came up in the last webinar for those participants who may be more used to conventional approaches to evaluation and trying to understand what evaluation means in the context of a NIC and what the difference is between the kind of evaluation that Jen is going to describe and the activities in a NIC versus what you may be more used to from other projects you've done for NSF or others. And I really kind of viewed this question in a personal way. In some ways, it recapitulates the trajectory of my own career and some issues that have concerned me for a long, long time. So I pose the question, is it research, evaluation, or improvement? I certainly started out with training as a researcher, and you know the usual drill when you're applying to NSF or someplace else for research funding. The researcher has an idea, often wanting to investigate the relationship between certain conceptual variables or some notion of those concepts and an intervention inspired by them, and then take it to a variety of students or teachers or schools. And when you think about it, that really captures the researcher's idea, and the educators or the students or the schools are a means to the end for the researcher in order to gather the data you need to test your hypothesis. That's how I started out, certainly in my own work, doing learning experiments with fourth graders and first graders provided to me by schools, not because the schools really cared about my hypothesis about verbal and visual memory, but because they were generally supportive of research and the kind of institution I came from. I found that unsatisfactory after a while. And then I had experience with evaluation where you take an education agency, a school district, a state, a particular school, and they may have a program or intervention that they've developed, and they want someone to come in and tell them, did it work or not? Did it produce value? And that's the role of an evaluator. But here, too, I found dissatisfaction because oftentimes there were things about the intervention one knew almost from the beginning were going to be problematic. And the questions you could ask and the kind of data you could look at were really limited. And I remember arguing early 90s, actually, to people in the Department of Education that what they really needed in the area of learning technology, which had both of these kinds of programs, was something that brought researchers and educators together to jointly identify a problem they really care about and to jointly design the change idea, where they were in a kind of equal power relationship to each other and collaborated over time. And that's what is really impressive to me about the improvement movement and the idea that here you know, as you're someone doing research, that you're working on something that educators really care about because you have jointly agreed upon the problem. You also are capitalizing on the knowledge they have of their context and the wisdom of practice in deciding what and when to measure and then reflecting on the data you get and then applying this iterative approach. So that's what largely appeals to me about improvement. And in a kind of personal way, that's the difference for me. But I realize the lines are often blurry, and sometimes people try to act as if there are really very sharp distinctions between the three, and I would argue that they're often much more fuzzy. But you can have a kind of by-the-book, textbook definition of these different enterprises, with research focusing on building that generalizable knowledge. So you're concerned with building knowledge for the field, often testing relationships among conceptual variables. So it's really this kind of abstract knowledge which is the most important part of the enterprise. In contrast, evaluation really is trying to look at the value of a program or intervention against some set of criteria, and especially looking at the impact of whatever the intervention or program is on one or more desired outcomes compared to some alternative. And that's certainly the dominant view of evaluation as we see in IES today. Whereas improvement is something different. You're really in improvement. You're not just worried about saying whether some intervention is good or not in general, and you're not just trying to build generalizable knowledge. You're actually trying to improve the quality and equity of outcomes within the organizations of the education partners. And so it really is a very different goal, which employs many of the kinds of measurement processes and outcome measures you might use in research or evaluation, as well as these really quick measures that can come with multiple iterations much more quickly. And we'll see that that has some implications. So I'll take some points from the last INCLUDES webinar. A NIC measurement system includes the long-term outcome measure on what the NIC has agreed is the educational goal and the target. There are many process measures along the way, and there are also intermediate outcome measures, something that you can get more quickly than the ultimate goal, which might be something like the rate of high school graduation, and you have to wait, of course, for students to mature through the years where you would expect high school graduation to be able to measure that long-term outcome. But when you take all those together and they're similar to what you might see in evaluations or research, then the question that came up in the last NIC towards the very end, which I thought was very interesting, was what is the difference between an evaluation and a NIC measurement system? And Alicia Grunow from Carnegie said, well, a measurement system that's good for improvement would be good for evaluation too, but not vice versa. So that's what really inspired me in thinking about what I wanted to say today, was kind of to test that statement. So if we think about classical evaluation types, which most of you are familiar with, I'm sure, there is that basic distinction between formative evaluations and summative. The classic definition of evaluation I showed earlier is really for summative evaluation. So this is something conducted on a completely designed program to determine whether or not it was effective. That is its value. One of my colleagues compares it to doing an autopsy as opposed to having a smoke detector, but you get the idea. Formative evaluations are done during the program development for purposes of refining the program and for helping it to be better. Now, there are some purists who believe that you actually shouldn't have the same person or organization doing both formative and summative evaluation. However, personally, I disagree with that. I think the trust that you build, the relationships, the knowledge of context, and important process variables during formative evaluation work helps you do a better summative evaluation. And an awful lot of the work we've done, we are doing both formative and summative evaluation with the same set of projects or actors. And one of the things that strikes me, if you think about formative evaluation and NIC measurement systems and improvement processes, is there actually is similarity in a number of the tools and approaches that you use. One of the first things we always do is develop what we call a theory of action or a theory of change. There are lots and lots of different templates for these. Some look a little bit more like a flow chart with lots of lines showing relationships. But the basic idea is, as you think about what the current situation is and where you want to go, you think about the outcomes you need, both the long-term outcomes, that is your ultimate impact you're looking for, more intermediate outcomes. You think about the inputs, what you're investing if you are, say, a foundation or a government agency or a school district. But you also have to think, very importantly, about those intermediate steps, the activities and the outputs, and what other things are necessary in order to link the activities that are going to happen to the outcomes you expect to happen. And what we find as evaluators is lots of times in laying this out, we find that the people we're working with have thought well about the inputs. I've got $200,000, and the outputs, I want a higher graduation rate, and only very vaguely about the things that happen in between and the logical connections between them. And often what we as evaluators do is we bring our clients to think about what is it that you need in addition to this activity. This activity cannot be done by teachers unless they receive appropriate supports and training, and where is the training to do that? So often what we're doing in the first phase of evaluation is really filling in the missing kinds of activities and those outputs that we could be measuring along the way to see if an intervention or a program is proceeding as it ought. Well, you can compare that to what you do in the improvement science, something like a driver diagram, and you see the one is going from left to right, the other is going from right to left, but actually if you fill in the driver diagram, and I could, as an evaluator, look at that as an implicit theory of action, and I could very easily frame that or describe that in theory of action terms. And likewise, a good theory of action, one that's not at too abstract a level, should actually be able to something that you could put into a driver diagram fairly easily. In both cases, the potential pitfalls are keeping at too high a level of abstraction so that what you're saying is not concrete enough to drive action, and not involving all the necessary players. Those are the two biggest pitfalls that we see. Going on, though, I think there are some important differences, and here I'm recapping something that Andy showed in the last webinar, which is when we do our collaborative data-intensive improvement research, the phases we think in terms of that he talked about at the last webinar, and these are the 5 phases. And certainly you'll be familiar with NIC activities of launching and coordinating improvement cycles, that is the test phase of this. But the first thing to notice is how much occurs before that. So there really, if you think about time frames, there's a lot more setup work than is typical in evaluation. The other thing is you're typically doing multiple small tests of change. And so down below the test, if you see, it's a little hard to see that, but those are the multiple PDSA cycles that may be happening in parallel at different sites within the NIC where you are testing different change ideas and seeing what the result is, and those things will actually be brought together to get your final idea. Now, when you compare that with what happens usually with evaluation, that's a place where I think you see some really big differences. And what you see is that usually it's a much more truncated process. Usually we find it's structured so there's a single large pilot test of the change or the intervention, during which there's formative evaluation activities, and then you implement the change and do the summative evaluation. So the chance to learn from iterations is much truncated compared to improvement science. And so I regard it really in a way as a much more risky activity. It's like trying to design a spaceship and you get one chance to try it out, and then the next one you're going to shoot off to Mars. Good luck. We've done many cases where we have evaluated for a client or portfolio of projects that all had the same outcome measure, so they had some relationship to NICS, that is at least the same general goal, and some constraints on the strategy they were supposed to use. So for example, using some form of learning technology with a certain age band to improve performance on tests of Common Core literacy. And I just had a few insights from those, from Battle Scars tests, which I offer these as you're starting to move toward thinking about building alliances. Something I've learned is that aligning incentives is really important. Usually the funder selects the organizations to implement the innovation or improvement effort. And if you think about the independence or the potential for loose coupling of that process with what's happening with the data measurement system, you can see where things could go awry. The organizations getting the grant will vary in the extent to which they have a well-thought-out theory of action at all, but regardless, they're almost certain to have different theories of action. If individual sites are funded without some common agreed-upon long-term outcome or measurement, it's going to be really, really hard to impose one afterwards. And that means it's going to be really hard to combine data. It's helpful to have a coordinating center that sets up services and tools to help sites collect and analyze the measures they need to test their change ideas, and to do that from the beginning. But at any rate, collaboration and coordination take time and cost money, so it needs to be structured in a way that the participants get enough value from their own perspective to motivate that collaboration and the time they have to invest in it. And then finally, just returning to the vice versa question to wrap up, can formative and summative evaluation provide the same benefits as improvement research? I think clearly the answer is no with respect to summative evaluation. I think in respect to formative evaluation, it comes much closer, as I tried to show, but there is little opportunity in those cases cross-site knowledge building, and you just have a single pilot iteration. So I would reinforce the fact that this is different when you come to NICS, and that there is, as Jen referred to, that chance for accelerated learning of a group of organizations in the same problem. And then that leads me just finally to, well, what haven't I talked about? And that's what we're going to return to Jen to talk about, which is how can you tell how well the NIC itself is functioning? And I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen. Stop sharing, and okay, I think you can take it back, Jen.
Great, thank you, Barbara. Great. So I am going to talk about, there we go. I'm going to talk in more depth about how my colleagues at the Carnegie Foundation and I have been conceptualizing developmental evaluation for networked improvement communities, taking up this question that Barbara left us with. Our developmental evaluation work is guided by a framework that we developed to describe the process of NIC development. We talked about this framework in the first webinar in this series, and it is archived on the Includes Project website. But briefly, it describes what we're trying to foster on the right. We're trying to develop a scientific and professional learning community that accelerates our capacity to improve. And then in the center of the framework, we have 5 domains of activity that we think are critical to operating a viable networked improvement community. In the very center, you see it's anchored in the problem of practice that all of the work of the networked improvement community is focused on addressing. And then the 3 domains around the problem of practice, we think of as the core technology of the network. They're developing a theory of how we will improve, the theory of practice improvement, using improvement research methods to drive testing of promising change ideas that lead to improvements and lead to learning about how to improve, and then using measurement and analytics. Those 3 core areas are similar to some of the work that Barbara talked about that's more similar to summative and formative evaluation, where we're trying to understand are changes leading to improvements, are we moving closer towards our network's aim. And I say that to contrast a bit of about what I'll continue to talk about, this developmental evaluation focus, which is, as we've thought about it in the context of NICS, more about understanding these outer rings and this driver. The outer rings describe the organization that we put together in a NIC to support this core work in the center. They're about cultivating the network's social organization and then fostering vital norms and identities consistent with the network's aim, the more cultural side of the NIC. And then out here, we describe leadership and many functions of leadership as really driving the development of these domains. And the developmental evaluation work that we do really focuses in on the leadership, the norms and identities, and the social organization. In other words, is the network developing in expected ways and in ways that would support doing the core improvement work? As we've first specified this NIC development framework, and I should note we do have a paper that describes this more fully. I think it is archived on the Includes website. As we've moved from this framework, we're moving towards a developmental model of what NICs look like at different stages of development. So, for example, we take one component of fostering vital norms and identities consistent with network aims, and that's building an evidence-based culture, and we describe what that looks like at initiation, what that looks like in a mature NIC, and hopefully over time we'll be able to specify the kind of developmental milestones along the way. Just to say briefly, as an example, as we think about the development of an evidence-based culture, we think when a networked improvement community is launched, the initiation team, the team that's driving the development of the NIC, should have an established framework for collecting common data to track progress towards the aim and guide local improvement work, as well as necessary data sharing agreements. But at the stage that a networked improvement community becomes a mature NIC, we expect to see more evidence of this evidence-based culture, that participants are feeling safe in sharing their data and engaging in critical conversations about what's working and what's not, and that members are actively seeking out others' successes identified through evidence and trying to learn from them. And again, that's just one example of one component of the framework, but we're moving towards this developmental model, and we're using our developmental evaluation work, tracking the development of various networked improvement communities to try to elaborate that developmental model. So how are we doing that? I'll describe a bit about how we've developed an aligned measurement framework. So we have certain measures that we're tracking as indicators of the development of networked improvement communities. for each one of the components of the framework, we've specified guiding questions, the type of data you might collect, and how you might analyze it. So for example, in this domain of activity related to fostering vital norms and identities and the focus on the development of an evidence-based culture, we're trying to understand what evidence suggests that network members feel safe in sharing data about their practice and critically reflecting on areas for improvement, or how network members are learning from each other and acting on that learning. Some of the ways that we think about collecting data in a network improvement community to understand if that culture is emerging, we're developing a network member survey that has survey items that we hope tap into this construct. And in our developmental evaluations, we typically administer that survey every 6 months. And then there are a range of other ways we think about getting insight into the emergence of this culture. We're reviewing meeting agendas for opportunities for members to engage with performance data. We're observing network convenings and other meetings to see whether members are sharing data about their practice and the openness with which they're doing this. And then we're utilizing things like a network's knowledge management system where people are logging their small tests of change and engaging in interactions to see whether network members are taking up change ideas that have been successful for others. And again, we're working on elaborating a measurement framework for all of the key components of NIC development, but this I just give as an example. We're also thinking about the fact that a developmental evaluation is best when it leverages multiple data sources for insight into the development of the NIC as an organization. And here's a bit of a starter list that we've thought about, different data sources that give us insight into NIC development. We're developing a range of surveys and self-assessment tools. For example, we have a self-assessment tool that members of the NIC initiation team can use to assess their readiness for launching the NIC and identifying critical areas where their network needs further development. I also mentioned the network member survey that we administer approximately every 6 months in the networks we're evaluating. We gather a range of project documents as a kind of record of the development and work of the network. We use interviews strategically, interviews with hub leaders on about an annual basis, and with network members at strategic moments in the NIC's development. We observe network convenings and often document the kind of conversation that's happening when we get network members together face-to-face. We are also documenting leadership meetings through observations. And we also are gathering data from what we call collaborative technology platforms. Many NICs are using spaces for members to engage in conversation, share what they're learning, for example, blog posts, and we can draw interesting data from those, both about the nature of the conversation, but also about the emerging connections in the network amongst the participants. I'll just highlight a couple of the tools that we've developed to support this developmental evaluation work. All of these tools we're currently testing, and we hope that by the fall we'll be in a place where we can make many of them available more broadly to the field. I mentioned the Hub self-assessment. We have a routine around this where Hub members complete the self-assessment both right before launch, but then approximately every 6 to 12 months into the operation of the NIC. Hub members complete a self-assessment that's aligned with our framework. Then the team gets together to discuss their perceptions of the network's development by aggregating the data from their individual self-assessments. Then they come to consensus and identify areas to prioritize for the development of the network. I mentioned the network survey. In addition to the items like we mentioned related to evidence-based culture or the other conceptual dimensions of our network development framework, we also include some network interaction survey items. So we're looking to see how the social organization of the network is emerging and generating representations like the picture on the screen, on the slide, of who's collaborating with whom, who's seeking out advice or support for the core work of the network. And here's an example of one of those that developed in one of our networked evaluations. And then finally, we've developed a NIC interview protocol to take a kind of deeper dive into NIC member experiences than you could get from a survey, and understanding things like how you describe the network, what members find most meaningful and exciting about the network, and what have been their challenges related to the work. This is really important, again, as we think about participation in a networked improvement community as largely being voluntary, and the critical need to make sure that network members are finding value in their work to sustain their participation in the hard work that it takes to be involved. It's also critical in developmental evaluation to think about feedback and reporting loops. Typically, we have approached this by setting quarterly priorities with network leaders, a focus for the developmental evaluation work. And we also prioritize providing rapid reports from data analyses as we're collecting these different data sources, feeding information back to network leaders and the whole network as rapidly as possible. So just briefly, I'll give you an example of some developmental evaluation work that's going on right now. I'm working with the Tennessee Early Literacy Network. The Tennessee Early Literacy Network is a networked improvement community that was recently launched by the Tennessee Department of Education with support from the Carnegie Foundation, and I'm acting as the developmental evaluator. And this network was launched because TDOE leaders were troubled by the rates of literacy proficiency they were seeing among third-grade students, especially given that we know that that's an important indicator of students' future academic and life trajectories. If they haven't learned to be literate, to be competent in reading for understanding by grade 3, they often have academic difficulties going forward. So this network was launched in fall of 2016. It's currently operating in 2 regions of the state. In one region, there are 3 participating districts, and the other, there are 4 participating districts, and a small number of schools in each district currently participating actively in the network, though the network over time will scale up to cover all 8 regions of the state. And the aim is to improve the proportion of students that are proficient in literacy by grade 3. Some of the work that we've done related to developmental evaluation for the TELIN network, prior to launch, in the phase where we were planning for the launch of the network and developing the capacity of district leads, regional leads, and the hub, I was observing and documenting the meetings of the initiation team. During formal face-to-face meetings where we've got together district leaders, regional leaders, and the core team from the Department of Ed and Carnegie, we were administering administering convening evaluations and trying to continually improve how we ran those face-to-face sessions together and the value they had for all participants. There was a very active blog space where district leads were learning about literacy in their local regions and sharing through blogs, and we were tracking the emergence of the network and the type of commenting that was happening across districts and regions in those commenting spaces. We saw a really interesting shift from a network that was pretty regionally focused in the beginning. People were tending to comment and interact with each other based on their geographic region. And a lot of the interaction was mediated by people from the hub of the network. Over time, though, we saw the kind of it become more and more decentralized and more connections across districts and regions. We also have done mini surveys around things like coaching calls, interviews with district leads, and we're gathering a range of documents. After the network was launched, we're doing many of the same things, though we've done some deeper dives into interviews with members of regional offices, which are core critical hubs in our network, and we've used the self-assessment tool that I described earlier to try to understand the hub's perception of the development of the network and prioritize some areas for improvement. And soon this spring we'll be 6 months into the network's development, and we'll for the first time to administer our network member survey. So hopefully that gives you a little picture of the comprehensive nature of the type of developmental evaluation work that we're doing, all aimed at supporting the network's development and its pursuit of its core improvement aim. And with that, I'll stop, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you both, Barbara and Jen, for your presentation and your comments on different looks at formative, summative evaluation and the ways in which it can play out within NICS. And so, with our remaining time, we hit our target right on the number. We have about 15 minutes left for from questions or comments from those participating live with us right now. The way it's worked in the past, for those of you who are new, please feel free to use the chat feature in the WebEx on the left-hand side of the screen, and or unmute your line, and please feel free to ask your question directly to Barbara or Jen. And I will give a little bit of wait time while we let folks either unmute their line or type. Then we can continue on with our discussion on evaluation. So we're giving folks time to gather their thoughts and or add into the chat window or email one of us directly. That's also been a strategy we've used in the past. I had a question both for Barbara and Jen sort of answered with each one of your perspectives in mind, and that is the role of the audience for these different styles, approaches, and products of evaluation. One way of thinking about audience are those who are participating in the work, those who are funding the work, interested researcher audiences, knowledge building. To what degree does audience factor into what you're doing and how you're doing it, both within the NIC development model to Jen, and then Barbara across the distinction of formative and summative evaluation?
Do you want to start, Jen?
Sure. We have thought a lot about audience in our developmental evaluation work for supporting NIC development. The network members are a key audience that we always have in mind, and you know, we're trying to always get their perceptions of their experience in the network. That's a critical component. But we also think carefully about how to share back information with them, and we make sure that anytime we're doing something that requires their time for data collection, we share back some sort of report of what we're learning very rapidly. For example, recently we did 2 rounds of interviews with both district leaders in the TELN network and regional leaders. And we developed a pretty extensive report for the network leadership team about from those interviews, but then also an abridged version that we could that would be less time intensive to digest, to send to all network members. We presented that at the most recent network convening, and then had an opportunity for network leaders to respond and say, we're hearing some of the challenges that you're encountering, certainly some of the successes as well, and here are some ways we're thinking about adjusting the way we operate the network to address those challenges. So audience is critical in that way. And then we're also thinking about the developmental evaluation work helps us to interrogate our theory of NIC development, which is something we think of as the audience is the field more broadly, both people who are trying to operate networked improvement communities and researchers who are studying this type of collaborative work among researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. So we're trying to develop products that have for a scholarly audience, for other practitioners, and that's really around this theory of network development. And I guess funders as well. We're trying to speak to funders as well because there has been so much interest in this type of funding for this type of work. So those, we're developing ways to communicate with those audiences.
I think from the standpoint of formative and summative evaluation of the work of the organizations, the NIC or whatever organizations you're working with per se, we have those same four audiences. So they're the internal audience of the people doing the work, the funders, policymakers, and the research community at large. The relative emphasis on those audiences does change, certainly between formative and summative evaluation. When we do formative work, the most involved, interested audience is really the people doing the work themselves. They get the most detailed feedback from the formative evaluation. And as Jen mentioned in developmental evaluation, here too, in any formative evaluation, the speed with which you can give people information is really important. So having information come quickly is more important than being able to pin down every single detail of the analysis, as long as you've appropriately indicated your basis for your inferences and not overstated them. So that really rapid feedback to the participants, oftentimes if we're doing a portfolio evaluation with multiple participants, we also keep that feedback particular to the participant. So in the really detail, we're careful about sharing it. In some cases, they're actually in a competitive relationship. We do provide formative evaluation information to funders, but there it's somewhat more abstracted, and you start deriving lessons learned, and those lessons learned across the different participant organizations are important for the funders, and that also is shared across all of the participants. So we treat that a little bit differently, and that likewise can go into the more scholarly literature and a more general audience. When you move to the summative evaluation realm, that's really, that's one of the things the funders are usually most concerned about, but also other policymakers who are making decisions about whether they should make a similar investment in other places. So those are two of the most, I would say, the primary audiences. And then similarly, there is the secondary audience of the general research field and building knowledge in the scholarly literature.
Just thinking about
do you have thoughts on this, Andy, that struck you about how the different audiences shape these activities?
Yeah, it's around the a follow-up I had to what you were just mentioning, Barbara, in terms of the way in which those who are fortunate enough to participate in a project that involves some kind of formative feedback, where the focus of the evaluation is allowed to change and become more tailored, better fit to the context or to the situation, versus a more traditional view, perhaps, of evaluation where a team might bring in the intervention, leave, and do sort of a pre-post, look at the changes that had happened over time. When you're thinking about folks who are able to participate and make use of formative feedback, and then Jen versus within a networked improvement community, what are the types of considerations that you have for comparing those who do the improvement work, the formative work, versus those who are not fortunate enough but just deal with the intervention as it's packaged, delivered, and set up for them? How do you negotiate some of that? What are some of the pitfalls, either in design, measurement, and then going back to our audience question, how you frame it and help folks make sense of the differences between those who were able to iteratively refine using a disciplined process versus were sort of set forth to work with an intervention as it was delivered?
Right, right. And I think that's a real issue. You know, one of the distinctions I made is for the in a traditional summative evaluation, there's a level of the participants, the people that are actually putting the intervention in place, who are strangely, you know, less targeted by the products of the evaluation, partly because a lot of those contextual variables tend to get lost in the way summative evaluations are usually set up. And the summative evaluation is often serving the needs of the funder more directly than the needs of, say, the particular teachers that are implementing something when you move to that level. So I think there is something that's definitely lost there, and I think that it's one of the reasons that doing a formative evaluation first, which can either help you provide, in some cases, more nuanced set of multiple outcomes for the summative evaluation, and also potential moderator variables or mediator variables that help people understand differences across different classrooms or different schools that may have really been trying to do something different. So avoiding the kind of one-size-fits-all version of an intervention where people talk about intervention fidelity. Did you do everything that was in the abstract model, as opposed to the kind of worth of the implementation for the local goals? So I think that is something that traditional evaluation tries to cope with but has a hard time coping with, that is more easily served within an improvement science context.
Your comment, Andy, made me think about how in a networked improvement community, there's going to be different levels of participation. So there are going to be some people at a given point in time that are really actively involved in developing change ideas, testing them rapidly, collaborating with others around this, really generating the promising ways to address the problem. But we also need a broader set of people in the networked improvement community that are willing to test things once they've gotten to a place where they're showing some promise in certain contexts. We want to try them out in diverse contexts, see if they hold up, see how that helps us learn about the problem and address it. So, you know, there really are varying levels of participation required. We need to build diverse participation structures so that people have different entry points to participation, different levels at different times. And I think that the developmental evaluation has to that's one of the critical things we try to understand, the varying experiences of people and what's motivating some to be those really like super users, super involved, versus others that are just trying things that other people have developed. Still both very valuable roles, but I think that that's one of the things that we're trying to theorize about and collect evidence about and share back with leaders, so we see if we have that kind of critical mix of participants. And so your comments just may be a little tangential, but they made me think about that.
Well, thank you both for both your thoughtful comments earlier and then in our discussion here. We're coming up on the hour, and so I wanted to put in a few more plugs to let folks know that they will have access to this recording, and to let their friends and colleagues know that it'll be posted hopefully within a couple of days, so that if you or your friends or colleagues were not able to attend, and if you know someone who would benefit from prior participation, that they can find it on includecenter.org, and that we look forward to seeing those who put in for participation in the face-to-face workshop. March 14th and 15th here in Menlo Park. And then with that, I want to thank both Barbara and Jen for their time and their preparation in their presentations. And then thanks to everyone who took time to join us today during the live webinar. So with that, I will say thank you, end the recording, and hopefully we'll see you this afternoon at the Communicating Within NICS webinar. And like I said, hopefully face-to-face here in California. So thanks again, everybody, for joining, and thanks to our presenters.
Thank you,
Andy.